What if the people sworn to protect you were the ones hunting you down? A former Navy SEAL, a corrupt police force, a town drowning in secrets. When Jordan Carter becomes the target of a deadly conspiracy, he has two choices: run or fight. But in Briarwood, justice isn't handed out, it's taken. And Jordan is about to show them what happens when you push the wrong man too far. The air in Briarwood carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a lingering reminder of the evening rain. It was a quiet town, the kind where people waved to each other from their porches, and where the biggest event of the month was the Friday night football game at the high school. But beneath that layer of southern hospitality, something darker brewed. Jordan Carter had been back for 3 months. After years of deployments as a Navy SEAL, he had expected this place to feel like home again. But it didn't. Maybe it never would. His house sat on the outskirts of town, a modest one-story with a wraparound porch and a yard that stretched into the dense tree line. He'd picked it because it was secluded. He didn't need neighbors stopping by uninvited. The only company he wanted was Bear, the German shepherd that had been with him since his last tour. The dog had been trained for combat, but here, he was just a companion, one that sensed things before Jordan did. His sister, Maya, worried about him. She was the only family he had left, and she had never stopped trying to pull him back into the world. She had left Briarwood for law school, made a name for herself in Atlanta, and somehow ended up back here, fighting for justice in a place that preferred to keep its skeletons buried. Jordan respected what she did, but he also knew it put a target on her back. It was a Wednesday evening when he first noticed the police cruiser. He had been stacking firewood when the glare of headlights reflected off his windows. The car sat idling at the end of his driveway, engine humming, but no one got out. After a minute, it rolled forward and disappeared down the road. The next day, it was there again, and the day after that. It wasn't random. Someone was watching him. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Small towns bred curiosity. Maybe a neighbor had mentioned his return, and the local cops were just taking an interest. But then came the grocery store. Jordan had only gone in for coffee and dog food, but as he stood in line, he felt it, a presence, the weight of someone's gaze. He turned and saw 2 men near the entrance, both in uniform. One was tall and broad, his shaved head glinting under the fluorescent lights. The other was leaner, his jaw set in a perpetual smirk. Daniel Roberts and Patrick Sullivan. Jordan knew their type before they even opened their mouths. The way they stood, the casual arrogance in their stance, the way their eyes lingered too long. Cops who enjoyed the power that came with the badge a little too much. Roberts leaned in, saying something low to Sullivan. They both laughed. Jordan forced himself to look away. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had already found him. By the time he stepped outside, the police cruiser was waiting at the curb. He ignored it, walking to his truck, but as soon as he pulled out of the lot, the cruiser followed. He checked his mirror. They weren't flashing their lights. They weren't pulling him over. Just following, mile after mile. Only when he turned onto the long dirt road leading to his house did the cruiser slow, then veer off onto a side street. It wasn't a warning, it was a message. That night, Jordan double-checked the locks before heading to bed. Bear lay curled up at the foot of the bed, ears twitching at every small noise. Jordan wasn't worried. He had seen worse men than Roberts and Sullivan. But sometime after midnight, Bear let out a low growl. Jordan's eyes snapped open. He sat up, scanning the darkened room. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees outside. But Bear's growl deepened. His body tensed. Something was out there. Jordan moved silently to the nightstand, grabbing the knife he always kept within reach. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he moved to the window, pressing against the wall as he peeked through the blinds. A car sat parked down the road, headlights off. Jordan's grip on the knife tightened. He slipped out of bed, moving toward the back door. Bear stayed close to his side, every muscle in the dog's body coiled tight. When he reached the door, he saw it. The gate to his yard was open. He knew for a fact he had locked it. He pushed the door open, stepping onto the porch. The night was still, too still. His breath came slow and steady as he scanned the tree line. Nothing. But someone had been here. Bear let out another growl. His nose pointed toward the trees. Jordan took another step forward, his pulse even, his senses on high alert. And then, a rustling. A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the trees. By the time Jordan reached the fence, whoever had been there was gone. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. They weren't done. Whoever they were, they would be back. And next time, he'd be ready. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of dew-soaked grass and freshly brewed coffee from the diner down the street. Jordan took a slow breath, adjusting the leash in his hand as Bear walked beside him. The dog's ears perked, always alert, but his tail wagged slightly as they moved along the familiar sidewalk. This was their routine, early morning walks, before the town fully woke up, before the streets became crowded with school buses and tired commuters. He wanted to believe last night had been a coincidence, maybe a local kid sneaking around, maybe a mistake, but his gut told him otherwise. The way the gate had been open, the way the cruiser had followed him home, the way the air felt just a little too still when he had stepped outside. He exhaled, pushing the thought aside as they entered the small park near the edge of downtown. It wasn't much, just a stretch of grass with a few picnic tables and a playground that had seen better days. It was quiet this time of morning, only a few people out for walks or sipping coffee on benches. Bear trotted ahead, nose low, sniffing at the damp ground. Then Jordan saw it, a police cruiser, idling at the curb just past the entrance. He felt it before he heard it, the way the air seemed to shift. The quiet tension that came when someone was watching. The engine cut off, the doors opened, two figures stepped out, Roberts and Sullivan. Jordan kept his pace steady, but his grip on Bear's leash tightened. The two officers walked toward him, casual but deliberate, like wolves closing in on their prey. "Morning," Roberts said, voice smooth, almost friendly. Sullivan was less subtle. "ID," he said, holding out a hand. Jordan met his eyes. "Excuse me?" Sullivan smirked. "ID, license, whatever you got on you." Jordan didn't move. "And the reason for this stop?" Roberts chuckled, shaking his head. "A guy like you, walking around here before most people are awake? Looks suspicious, don't you think?" Jordan felt his jaw clench. He kept his voice calm. "I'm walking my dog. That's not a crime." Roberts tilted his head. "That depends." Bear let out a quiet growl. Sullivan's hand twitched toward his belt, fingers grazing the handle of his holstered gun. Not a full motion, just enough to be noticed. A silent warning. Jordan recognized the tactic. He'd seen it before, in places where men with power didn't need a reason to pull the trigger. He wasn't going to give them one. "I don't carry my license when I walk my dog," he said, voice even. Sullivan clicked his tongue. "That's a shame. Makes things complicated." Jordan knew how this worked. No matter what he said, they had already decided how this interaction was going to go. A movement caught his eye. A man, standing near the park entrance. Older, wearing a worn-out baseball cap and a flannel jacket. He was watching, but the moment Jordan met his gaze, he looked away. Carl Dawson. Jordan didn't know him, but he had seen him around town before. The way the man shifted on his feet, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, he had seen something like this before. He wasn't going to get involved. "Relax, Carter," Roberts said, stepping forward. "Just doing our job." Then he glanced down at Bear. "Nice dog. These kinds can be real aggressive." Though, Jordan's spine went rigid. Roberts reached toward his belt. Not for his gun, but for the black baton clipped to his side. Jordan stepped in front of Bear. "Don't," he said, his voice lower now. Robert's smirk didn't waver. "Relax," he said, mimicking his own words from a moment ago. He tapped the baton against his palm. "Just making sure he's not a threat." Bear's growl deepened. Jordan didn't blink. "He's not." Roberts stared at him for a long moment, then let out a small laugh. Shaking his head. "Not worth the paperwork," he muttered, stepping back. Sullivan sighed, feigning disappointment. "Looks like you're free to go, Carter." Jordan didn't move right away. Roberts leaned in slightly, voice just for him. "We'll be seeing you around," he said, quiet but pointed. "Sooner than you think." They turned, walking back to the cruiser. Jordan exhaled slowly. He glanced toward the park entrance again. But Carl Dawson was already walking away, head down. hands stuffed in his pockets. Jordan gave Bear's leash a small tug. The dog hesitated for a second, then followed. This wasn't over. The days that followed were anything but normal. Jordan had learned to trust his instincts. And they told him one thing. Roberts and Sullivan weren't done with him. He wasn't paranoid. The signs were everywhere. A police cruiser parked down the road. Lights off, engine humming. A car following him just a little too long before turning away. A patrol vehicle idling outside the diner when he stopped in for coffee. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't random. It was a message. Maya was the first to say it out loud. "They're baiting you," she told him over dinner one evening. "They want you to react. To slip up. You know that, right?" Jordan stabbed at the food on his plate but didn't eat. He knew she was right. "I won't give them what they want," he said. She didn't look convinced. "You need to be careful," she said, softer this time. "They're not playing fair." Jordan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in. He wasn't afraid of Roberts and Sullivan. He'd dealt with worse men in worse places. But this wasn't a battlefield. Here, the enemy wore a badge, carried authority, and had the power to twist the truth. That night, he made a decision. If they were watching him, he'd watch them too. The next morning, before heading out, he slipped a small, body-worn camera into the inside pocket of his jacket. It was barely noticeable, but it recorded everything. If they tried anything, he'd have proof. It didn't take long for them to make their next move. Jordan was driving home from the grocery store when the familiar wail of a siren filled the air. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Red and blue lights flashed behind him. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. The cruiser stopped just behind him. The doors opened. Roberts and Sullivan stepped out. Jordan kept both hands on the wheel as they approached. His heartbeat was steady, but he could already feel where this was going. Sullivan tapped on the window. Jordan rolled it down halfway. "Step out of the vehicle," Sullivan said, voice casual but firm. Jordan didn't move. "For what?" Roberts leaned against the side of the truck. Arms crossed. "License and registration." Jordan reached for the glove compartment. Moving deliberately, he handed over his papers without a word. Sullivan barely glanced at them before tucking them under his arm. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated. Jordan met his gaze, holding it for a beat before finally pushing the door open and stepping out. He wasn't going to give them an excuse to escalate. Sullivan circled around him, eyeing him up and down. "You been drinking tonight?" Jordan let out a slow breath. "No." Roberts moved to the back of the truck. "Pop the trunk." Jordan frowned. "Why?" Roberts smirked. "Just a routine check." There was no point arguing. Jordan pressed the button on his key fob, unlocking the trunk. Roberts walked to the back, peered inside. Then, slowly, he reached in. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding a small, clear plastic bag filled with white powder. Jordan's stomach turned. Roberts held it up between two fingers, letting the streetlights catch it. Then he looked at Jordan and grinned. "Well, look at that." Jordan stayed silent. His mind was already racing. Sullivan let out a whistle. "I'm guessing this isn't yours?" Jordan clenched his jaw. "You know damn well it's not." Roberts clicked his tongue. "That's funny, because it was sitting right here in your truck." Jordan's hands curled into fists. But he forced himself to stay still. This wasn't some bar fight. If he reacted, they'd have exactly what they needed. Sullivan stepped closer, tilting his head. "See, Carter, you're new in town. People don't really know you. But this is enough to put you away for a long time." Jordan held his gaze. He could see it in their eyes. They were enjoying this. They had planned this, and they thought they had won. Then Roberts reached for his cuffs. Jordan didn't resist when his arms were yanked behind his back. The cold metal snapped shut around his wrists. "This should be fun," Roberts murmured, giving him a shove toward the car. As they forced him into the back seat, Jordan caught sight of a few bystanders watching from across the street. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Others turned away. But one face stood out. Carl Dawson, the man from the park. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for only a second before Carl dropped his gaze and walked away. Jordan exhaled slowly as the door slammed shut behind him. This wasn't just about Roberts and Sullivan anymore. It was bigger than that. Maya Carter had spent years navigating courtrooms, standing her ground against men in suits who thought power gave them the right to twist the law. But tonight, as she walked into the Briarwood police station, she wasn't facing polished attorneys or corporate executives. She was facing something worse, an institution built to protect itself. The station had the sterile feel of every small town precinct. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the dull gray walls. Officers moved in and out of the lobby, some glancing at her with mild curiosity, others pretending she wasn't there. But she wasn't here for them. She was here for her brother. At the front desk, a heavy-set officer in his 50s barely looked up from his paperwork. His name tag read D. Larkin. "I need to see my client," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Jordan Carter. He was brought in last night." Larkin smirked, flipping through a stack of folders with deliberate slowness. Carter, here we go. Looks like he's being processed." Maya clenched her jaw. "Processed for what? What are the charges?" Larkin shrugged. "Possession with intent." Her fingers dug into the leather strap of her purse. "That's ridiculous. And you know it." He lifted an eyebrow. "Then let the courts decide." Maya leaned in. "I want to speak to the sheriff. Now." Larkin exhaled through his nose like she was an inconvenience. "Sheriff Clark doesn't take unscheduled visits." Maya smiled tightly. "Tell him it's either me now or a legal complaint on his desk by morning." That got his attention. He gave her one long, irritated look before picking up the phone and muttering into the receiver. A minute later, he waved her through. Sheriff Raymond Clark's office was at the end of the hall. His door was open, and he didn't bother standing when she entered. He was in his early 60s, with a thick mustache and a belly that pressed against his belt. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished, a man who had been in the game long enough to know how to play it. Clark gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Carter, what can I do for you?" She didn't sit. "You can release my brother." Clark leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "And why would I do that?" "Because the charges are false. You know it. I know it. Everyone in this town knows it." Clark exhaled like a man dealing with a petulant child. "Miss Carter, if your brother is innocent, I'm sure the courts will clear him. But right now, he's in our custody, and the legal process will take its course." Maya studied him, looking for a crack in the performance. But there was nothing. He was calm, composed, the kind of man who had spent years perfecting the art of plausible deniability. She took a step closer. "If anything happens to him, I will make sure this department is investigated from top to bottom." "You think a little badge protects you? It won't protect you from a federal lawsuit." Clark's smile was thin. "I admire your passion. Really, I do. But threats won't get you what you want." Maya held his gaze. "We'll see about that." She turned on her heel and walked out before he could respond. Outside, the air was thick with humidity, the night pressing in around her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. "It's been a while, Maya." She didn't waste time. "I need a favor." Carl Dawson's trailer sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between rusting cars and overgrown grass. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. Maya knocked twice. No answer. She knocked again, louder. The door creaked open just enough for her to see a tired, lined face peering through the crack. Carl's voice was wary. "What do you want?" Maya didn't hesitate. "You saw what happened at the park. You know my brother didn't do anything wrong." Carl glanced past her, checking the road. "I don't want trouble." She stepped forward. "You already have trouble, Carl. The only question is whether you want to do something about it." His jaw tightened. "I got a daughter, a grandson. I can't. They won't stop." Maya cut in. "Not with Jordan. Not with you. Not with anyone who doesn't fall in line." Carl swallowed hard, but then his expression hardened. "I can't help you." Maya felt the conversation slipping. She could push harder, but fear was a powerful thing. She had seen it too many times before. She took a step back. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." The door shut in her face. Inside the station, Jordan sat in a holding cell, his back against the wall. The room smelled like sweat and cheap disinfectant, the kind that never really masked the stench of old concrete and bad decisions. Sullivan had passed by twice already, smirking like he was enjoying every second of this. Jordan stayed silent. He knew how this worked. You wait, you watch, you don't give them anything. What they didn't know was that he had something too. The small camera inside his jacket had been recording the whole time. Every word, every movement, somewhere in this building, that footage existed, and someone had seen it. Jessica Tran didn't consider herself a risk-taker. She worked the night shift because it was quiet. Less hassle, less pressure. But tonight, something had caught her eye. The footage from Jordan Carter's arrest had been automatically uploaded to the station's internal server. She hadn't thought much of it, until she saw the moment Sullivan reached into the truck's trunk and pulled out something that hadn't been there before. She watched the clip 3 times. Then she made a choice. Plugging in a flash drive. She copied the file, tucked it into her pocket, and logged out. She didn't know what she was going to do with it yet. But she knew she couldn't ignore it. Jordan didn't expect to be released. Not without a fight. So when Larkin appeared the next morning and unlocked the cell door, he felt it before he heard it. Something wasn't right. No charges, Larkin said, almost bored. You're free to go. Jordan pushed himself up. Just like that? Larkin shrugged. Guess you got lucky. Jordan didn't believe in luck. When he stepped out into the morning air, Sullivan was waiting. The cop took a slow step forward, lowering his voice so only Jordan could hear. I don't know how you pulled that off, he murmured, eyes cold, but you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Jordan didn't flinch. Sullivan leaned in slightly, his breath laced with coffee and something sour. This isn't over. Jordan met his gaze, steady and unshaken. He already knew that. By the next morning, Jordan's name was everywhere. The local paper ran a headline that read, Ex-Navy SEAL arrested for drug possession, violent history uncovered. A radio segment on the morning news speculated about how someone with his background could be a threat to the town's safety. The same faces that used to nod at him in the grocery store now turned away when he passed. He had expected this. Maya, on the other hand, had not. They're painting you as a damn criminal, she said, pacing across his living room, holding up her phone. The stories on every news site in town. Jordan leaned back against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. That's the point. She stopped, narrowing her eyes. You're telling me you saw this coming? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Not the headlines, but this? The smear campaign? Yeah. Maya's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, hesitated, then put it face down on the table. Jordan caught the flicker of something in her expression. What? He asked. She hesitated. Some of my clients, they're pulling out. A few said they appreciate my work, but don't want their names attached to radical cases. Jordan's stomach tightened. They're pressuring you. She let out a sharp breath. I can handle it. But Jordan knew how these things worked. It wasn't just about discrediting him. It was about isolating him. Making sure anyone who tried to help paid a price. Later that night, he found out just how far they were willing to go. His phone vibrated with an unknown number. He almost ignored it but picked up at the last second. A distorted voice, low and urgent. Check your email. The line went dead. Jordan stared at the screen for a moment before walking over to his laptop. When he opened his inbox, there was a single new message. No subject line, no sender name, just an attachment labeled, Play Me. He clicked. The video was grainy, pulled from a police body cam. But the scene was clear. Sullivan standing beside his truck. Roberts reaching into the trunk, pulling out the bag of white powder Jordan had never seen before. Their voices were muffled but audible. Roberts laughed. This should do it. Sullivan smirked. Hope he likes orange jumpsuits. The screen cut to black. Jordan sat back in his chair. His pulse was steady, but his mind was already calculating. A second later, another email came in. This one had a single line of text. You can't trust anyone inside the department. Be careful. No name, no signature. But Jordan had a good idea who had sent it. Jessica Tran. He needed to move. Maya's first instinct was to send the footage straight to the FBI. This is enough to bury them. Jordan shook his head. Not yet. She stared at him like he had lost his mind. Not yet? Jordan, this is proof. We don't need anything else. He ran a hand over his face. If we go to the feds now, They'll shut it down before it even starts. We need more. We need a pattern. This can't just be about me. Maya let out a frustrated sigh but didn't argue. That night, Jordan made a plan. At 2:17 a.m., Jordan sat in his truck, parked half a block away from the police station. The town was mostly asleep, the streets silent except for the occasional passing car. In his lap was a small laptop, the screen glowing softly. A few years ago, he wouldn't have been able to do this. But in the teams, they had been trained in more than just combat. Information warfare was a battlefield of its own. He ran a program, bypassing the station's outdated firewall. A minute later, he was inside, scrolling through records. He searched for arrests made by Roberts and Sullivan in the last 5 years. The list was long, too long. Names appeared. Most he didn't recognize. But then, Carl Dawson, the old man from the park. Jordan clicked the file. Arrested 2 years ago for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. The report, written by Sullivan, claimed Dawson had attacked officers during a routine stop. There was no video evidence, no witness statements, just a few lines of text confirming that Dawson had served 6 months in county jail. Jordan stared at the screen. Carl had lied to him. Or worse, Carl had been scared to tell the truth. Jordan closed the laptop. Tomorrow, he was going to find out why. Carl Dawson's trailer was a battered thing, its paint long faded by years of sun and rain. A thin line of smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life inside. Jordan stood on the small wooden porch, knocking twice. The wood creaked under his weight. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. A few seconds passed before the door opened just enough for Carl to peer out. His face was lined with deep creases, the kind that came from years of hard living. His eyes darted past Jordan, scanning the yard, before settling on him. "We need to talk," Jordan said. Carl shook his head. "Ain't got nothing to say." Jordan exhaled, keeping his voice level. "I saw your file, Carl. I know what happened 2 years ago. I know Roberts and Sullivan arrested you." Carl flinched, just barely, but enough for Jordan to see it. "I need to know what they did to you," Jordan continued, "because I think it's still happening. To other people." Carl tightened his grip on the doorframe. "I got a daughter," he muttered. "I can't help you." Jordan took a step forward. "Carl, they framed me. They put drugs in my truck. You think they won't do worse to someone else?" Carl's jaw twitched. He looked past Jordan again, then down at his own hands. "They told me if I ever talked, my daughter would lose her job. That her boy wouldn't be safe." Jordan swallowed. He had expected something like this. Fear was a powerful thing, and the people running Briarwood knew how to use it. Carl shifted, and for the briefest second, Jordan caught a glimpse of something inside the trailer. A folded piece of paper pinned to the kitchen table. A seal stamped in the corner. The Briarwood Police Department. Before Jordan could say another word, Carl stepped back and shut the door. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. Jordan was halfway down a back road, the trees thick on either side, when he noticed it, a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. The car had been behind him for the last 2 miles, keeping its distance, never passing, never falling back. A tail. Jordan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He slowed slightly, just enough to see if they would pass. They didn't. Then, without warning, the headlights surged forward. Jordan barely had time to react before the impact slammed into him. Metal crunching against metal. His truck jolted forward, tires skidding over loose gravel. He fought for control, yanking the wheel to keep from spinning out. Another hit, harder this time, sent his truck careening toward the ditch. At the last second, he wrenched the wheel, forcing the truck to fishtail. The momentum sent him sideways, tires digging into the dirt before coming to a violent stop. The other car screeched to a halt behind him. Jordan's breath was steady, controlled. His instincts kicked in before his thoughts could. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, moving with a purpose. Not a cop, no uniform, no badge, just a man in dark clothes, built like someone who knew how to handle himself. Jordan didn't wait for an introduction. The man lunged. Jordan sidestepped, using the attacker's own momentum against him. He drove an elbow into the man's ribs. But the guy barely reacted. Trained, The attacker swung, fast and precise. Jordan blocked the first hit but took the second across the jaw. Pain flared, sharp but manageable. They grappled, boots scraping against the dirt. The man tried to pin him, but Jordan twisted free, landing a hard strike to the side of his head. The attacker stumbled. Jordan didn't hesitate. He drove a knee into the guy's stomach, then followed it with a punch to the jaw. The man went down. Jordan stood over him, breathing hard. The attacker groaned, rolling onto his back. His eyes flickered open, dazed but aware. "You don't know what you're messing with," he rasped. "They won't stop." Jordan narrowed his eyes. "Who sent you?" The man coughed but didn't answer. Jordan reached for his pockets, searching for a wallet, an ID. Nothing. No license. No credit cards. No name. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't meant to exist. For the first time since this started, Jordan felt it. A real, tangible sense of danger. This wasn't just about two cops abusing their power. This was bigger. Jordan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone he had taken off the man who tried to kill him. The device was locked, its black screen reflecting the dim light overhead. Whoever sent that guy knew how to cover their tracks. No ID, no wallet, no trace. But everyone left a trail. Maya stood across from him, arms crossed. "You really think this guy was just some hired thug?" Jordan exhaled, rubbing the tension from his jaw. "No, he was trained. Military, maybe law enforcement, someone who knows how to fight." He tapped the phone against the table. "And someone who doesn't exist on paper." Maya pulled her laptop closer, fingers moving across the keyboard. "Let's see what we can find." Jordan slid the phone over. "It's locked. Might be encrypted." She smirked. "Nothing stays locked forever." For the next hour, they worked in silence. Jordan watched as Maya bypassed security layers, running software that exploited weak points in the phone's encryption. Eventually, a list of contacts appeared on the screen. Most were just numbers, no names, no details, except for one. Boss. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Who the hell is Boss? Maya clicked on the contact, but there was no call history, no messages, just a single outgoing transaction buried in the phone's payment logs. A deposit. Large. Jordan leaned in. That's not just hush money. That's a payday. Maya copied the information and ran a trace. A few minutes later, a company name popped up. Briarwood Security Solutions. Jordan frowned. Never heard of them. Maya shook her head. Because they don't really exist. They're a shell company. No website. No office. Just a mailing address and a bank account. She clicked through a few more files, her expression darkening. Guess who owns it? Jordan already knew. Raymond Clark. Jordan pulled his truck into a quiet parking lot across from the Briarwood Police Department. He killed the engine, watching through the windshield as officers came and went. This wasn't about Roberts and Sullivan anymore. They were just players in a bigger game. Clark wasn't just covering for dirty cops, he was running a business. Jordan checked his phone. He had compiled everything. Bank records, payment logs, company filings, enough to prove that Clark was funneling money through a fake company to pay off enforcers. But he needed confirmation. He texted Jessica Tran. "Meet me. It's urgent." A minute later, 3 dots appeared. Then, "Tonight, my place." Jessica Tran's apartment was in a quiet complex near downtown. The kind of place where people kept their heads down and didn't ask questions. Jordan pulled up just after midnight, shutting off his lights before stepping out. Something felt off. The front door was slightly open. A cold sensation settled in his gut. He pushed it open. The apartment was dark. Papers were scattered across the floor. A chair lay on its side. A laptop, screen cracked, rested near the couch. No sign of Jessica. Jordan took a slow breath. Scanning the room, there was no struggle, no blood. Whoever had taken her knew how to work clean. He crouched, picking up a torn piece of paper, part of a printed email. A single word stood out. FBI. Jordan clenched his jaw. Jessica had tried to warn him. Now she was gone. The apartment complex had security cameras, but Jordan doubted they'd be much help. The kind of men who took Jessica Tran weren't the kind to leave evidence behind. Still, he needed to see for himself. Standing in the dimly lit hallway outside her door, He pulled up the footage on his phone. Maya had managed to access the building's security system remotely, and the grainy black and white images played in a loop. Two men, dressed in black, no hesitation, no wasted movement. They picked the lock, entered, and were gone in under 3 minutes. Jessica never stood a chance. Jordan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the phone. Maya's voice crackled through his Bluetooth earpiece. Her numbers disconnected. Jordan exhaled slowly. They cut her off. A pause. Then Maya's voice, softer now. You think she's alive, he said, more certain than he felt. If they wanted her dead, they wouldn't have taken her. Another pause. Then, what now? Jordan looked back at the shattered doorframe, at the papers still scattered inside. Jessica had been sitting on something big, something worth killing for. We go on the offensive, he said. Back at his place, Jordan powered up his laptop. If he had learned anything from his time overseas, it was that information was a weapon. And right now, he needed an arsenal. With a few keystrokes, he slipped into the police department's database. Their cybersecurity was laughable. Outdated firewalls, weak encryption, the kind of security built to keep nosy locals out. Not someone like him. He filtered through financial transactions, looking for anything that tied Roberts and Sullivan to the shell company he had found earlier. It didn't take long. 2 payments, both large, both funneled through Briarwood Security Solutions, the same fake company linked to the man who tried to kill him. Jordan stared at the screen. This wasn't just about dirty cops skimming off the top. This was organized, funded, protected, and the money wasn't coming from the police department. It was coming from somewhere higher. Maya's voice broke through his thoughts. I have a contact at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. A guy who specializes in corruption cases. Jordan nodded, already knowing where she was going. We leak it. She hesitated. It won't be enough. They'll bury it unless we have more. We'll get more. Maya sighed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? He didn't answer. Because the truth was, a part of him was. The house was dark when Jordan pulled up. No lights on, no sound except the steady chirp of crickets in the distance. Something was wrong. He stepped out of the truck, scanning the perimeter. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his body already shifting into combat mode. The front door was closed, but the lock was broken. A sliver of moonlight reflected off the splintered wood. Slowly, he stepped inside. The smell of spray paint hit him first. Then he saw the message, scrawled in jagged red letters across the living room wall. You have no idea WHO you're messing with. Jordan exhaled through his nose, forcing his pulse to stay steady. They weren't just watching him. They were warning him. Except they had made one mistake. They thought he would back down. He wasn't going to. Jordan sat in the dim glow of his laptop screen, his fingers tapping against the table in slow, deliberate movements. The weight of the past few days pressed against his shoulders. Jessica was gone. His house had been broken into. And now, whoever was behind this had escalated. The message on his wall wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. They wanted him to be afraid. Instead, it only made him more determined. His cursor hovered over a name in his contacts. David Mitchell. Mitchell had built his career exposing corruption. Cops, politicians, corporations. He didn't care who they were, if they were dirty. He burned them down. If anyone could bring this story into the light, it was him. Jordan took a breath, then hit dial. The call connected after 3 rings. Mitchell. It's Jordan Carter. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. Last time we talked, you told me to stay the hell away from Briarwood. Jordan exhaled. Things have changed. That's so? I've got something, Jordan said. Something big. There was a shift in Mitchell's tone. How big? Jordan didn't hesitate. Police corruption, payoffs, a shell company tied to the sheriff, and a missing informant. Mitchell let out a low whistle. That's quite a list. You got proof? Jordan's grip on his phone tightened. Enough to start burning the foundation. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, Carter, you know how this works. If you're right, I'll take it public. But if you're wrong, I'm not wrong. Another pause. Then Mitchell sighed. Meet me tomorrow. I'll text you a location. Be careful, Jordan said. Mitchell let out a dry laugh. You too. Jordan hung up. His jaw set. Now it was a race. Whoever struck first would win. Maya stood frozen in her doorway, her hands gripping the edges of a manila envelope. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts as she stared at the photos scattered across her kitchen counter. Pictures of her, of Jordan, taken from a distance, at her office, outside her apartment, meeting clients, even at Jordan's house. Someone had been watching them. For weeks. A single sheet of paper rested on top of the pile. The words were printed in bold, precise letters. Stop, or someone dies. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Jordan's voice snapped her out of it. Maya. She turned sharply to see him standing in the doorway. He took one look at the pictures and the note, and his expression hardened. They're panicking, he said. Maya swallowed. This isn't panic, Jordan. This is a promise. He stepped forward, picking up one of the photos. It was grainy, but the message was clear. Someone had been close enough to track their every move. Maya crossed her arms, her voice quieter now. You still think we can win this? Jordan met her eyes. The fact that they did this means we're getting close. She let out a shaky breath. And if they don't stop at warnings? Jordan didn't answer, because he already knew the truth. They wouldn't. The night air was thick with humidity as Jordan stepped out of Maya's apartment complex. The streets were quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. He scanned the area, his instincts prickling. Then he heard it, an engine revving. Fast. Jordan turned just in time to see the black SUV barreling toward him. His body reacted before his mind could. He dove sideways, rolling onto the pavement as the vehicle screeched past. Tires skidded, leaving black streaks on the asphalt. The SUV didn't slow. It kept going, disappearing around the corner. Jordan pushed himself up, his heart pounding. They weren't sending messages anymore. They were making their move. Mitchell's office smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. Stacks of papers littered the desk, and a corkboard along the wall was pinned with articles, maps, and hastily scribbled notes. The room had the air of controlled chaos, the kind only someone who lived and breathed their work could maintain. Jordan leaned over the desk, watching as Mitchell scrolled through financial records on his laptop. A string of numbers filled the screen. Transaction dates, bank accounts, sums of money large enough to make a man disappear. Mitchell let out a low whistle. This isn't just dirty cops lining their pockets. This is an operation. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Who's pulling the strings? Mitchell clicked on a flagged entry, pulling up the name of the company Jordan had seen before. Briarwood Security Solutions. Jordan had expected that, but what he hadn't expected was the next name that appeared. Mayor Richard Beckett. Mitchell exhaled through his nose. Well, hell. Jordan straightened. The mayor? Mitchell leaned back, rubbing his jaw. It makes sense. You need top cover to run something this big. Someone to make sure nobody digs too deep. The cops work the ground game. But someone like Beckett? He pointed to the screen. He's the reason they've been untouchable. Jordan's fingers curled into fists. How many people are in on this? Mitchell scrolled further, scanning names tied to suspicious payments. Couple of city officials, a judge, a handful of business owners funneling money. And get this. Our friend Sheriff Clark is sitting right at the center of it. Jordan exhaled slowly. His fight had just escalated from 2 corrupt cops to an entire power structure. He looked at Mitchell. We need more than numbers on a screen. We need something they can't bury. Mitchell gave him a knowing look. Then we go straight to the source. The Briarwood Police Department was a squat, 2-story building with a worn-out facade and security cameras mounted at every corner. At this hour, the lot was mostly empty. Just a few patrol cars lined up near the entrance. Jordan and Mitchell moved quickly, staying close to the shadows. Maya was stationed a block away, monitoring police frequencies from her laptop. I'm in their system, she whispered through Jordan's earpiece. Cameras are on a loop. But you've got 10 minutes before I have to reset them. Jordan glanced at Mitchell. Let's move. They slipped in through the side entrance, avoiding the main hallway where night shift officers were stationed. Mitchell led the way, his experience as an investigative reporter evident in how he navigated unfamiliar spaces. They reached Clark's office without incident. Jordan pulled out a slim metal tool, working the lock with careful precision. A few seconds later, the door clicked open, The office smelled like old leather and cigar smoke. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A heavy wooden desk dominating the center of the room. Jordan moved to the desk while Mitchell went for the cabinets. "Check for personnel files," Jordan murmured. Mitchell nodded, rifling through the drawers. Jordan booted up Clark's computer, inserting a flash drive Maya had given him. A progress bar appeared, copying everything on the hard drive. Mitchell let out a sharp breath. "Got something." He pulled out a thick folder and flipped it open. Inside was a list of names, dates, and case numbers. Jordan read over his shoulder. Carl Dawson, Jessica Tran, a dozen other names. Mitchell's expression darkened. "This isn't just corruption. This is a hit list." Maya's voice came through their earpieces. "Urgent, guys. You need to get out. Now." 2 officers just pulled up outside. Jordan grabbed the folder and yanked the flash drive from the computer. "We're moving." They slipped back into the hallway, making their way toward the exit. Then the gunshot rang out. Mitchell stumbled forward, gasping, a crimson bloom spreading across his shirt. Jordan's reflexes took over. He grabbed Mitchell under the arms and pulled him behind a row of lockers. Maya's voice was frantic. "What the hell just happened?" "Sniper," Jordan gritted out. He scanned the lot through the narrow window, spotting movement on the rooftop across the street. Another shot shattered the glass. Jordan ducked, shielding Mitchell's body. Mitchell's breaths came in ragged gasps. Jordan pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Mitchell's fingers tightened around Jordan's wrist. His voice was weak but steady. "Don't let them bury this." Jordan swallowed hard. He wouldn't. The city lights blurred in the side mirror as Jordan gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles white. The SUV tore down the highway, weaving through the night as Maya sat beside him, her breath uneven. Mitchell was dead. The words ran through his head like a loop, but there was no time to process them. They had barely made it out of the ambush. The sniper had been precise. 1 shot, straight to the chest. By the time Jordan had dragged Mitchell into the cover of an alley, he was gone. Now, Jordan and Maya were fugitives. Maya's voice broke the silence. "This is insane." Jordan didn't respond. She turned to him, her voice rising. "Do you even hear me? We're being hunted, Jordan. By the police. By professionals. And now a reporter is dead because of us." He tightened his jaw, keeping his focus on the road. "Because of them." Maya exhaled sharply. "You think that matters? You think anyone will care? They control the narrative. By morning, Mitchell will be just another unsolved shooting. And we'll be ghosts." Jordan glanced at her, his voice calm but firm. "Then we make sure the truth doesn't die with him." Maya shook her head, staring out the window. "We're running out of options." Jordan didn't argue, because she was right. They pulled into an abandoned lot near the outskirts of town. The kind of place no one paid attention to. Jordan killed the engine. The only sound left was the hum of crickets in the distance. Maya slumped against the seat, rubbing her temples. "Tell me you have a plan." Jordan reached into his bag, pulling out the files they had taken from Clark's office. He flipped through the pages, scanning the names. Then he stopped. Carl Dawson. His mind raced. Why was Carl on this list? The old man was no threat, just a scared witness trying to survive. Unless. Jordan's grip on the paper tightened. "I need to see him." Maya frowned. "Who?" "Carl." She shook her head. "Are you serious? We need to disappear, not go knocking on doors." Jordan ignored her, already putting the truck into gear. Something wasn't right, and he needed to know why. Carl's house was dark, the porch light flickering weakly. Jordan stepped out first, scanning the street before approaching the front door. It was slightly ajar. His stomach knotted. Maya whispered behind him, "This is bad." Jordan pushed the door open. Inside, the place was a mess. The coffee table had been overturned, drawers pulled from cabinets, papers scattered across the floor. A single chair sat in the middle of the room. Carl was tied to it, his head slumped forward, a cut visible along his temple. His chest moved slightly, still alive. Jordan rushed forward. "Carl?" Before he could reach him, something cold pressed against the back of his skull. "A gun." A voice followed, low and taunting. "I warned you, Carter, but you never know when to quit." Jordan's pulse stayed steady. but his muscles tensed. He knew that voice. Roberts. Footsteps sounded behind him. More than one set. Hands where I can see them. Roberts ordered. Jordan slowly raised them. Maya barely had time to react before Sullivan stepped into view. His own gun trained on her. Roberts smirked. You made this real easy for us. Jordan clenched his jaw. If you were going to kill me, you'd have done it already. Roberts chuckled. Oh, Carter, who said anything about killing you? Jordan's eyes flickered to Carl. There was more at play here. And he was about to find out exactly what. Jordan could taste blood. It coated his tongue, thick and metallic. As he gasped for air, his ribs ached from the relentless punches. And his right eye was swelling shut. His arms were tied behind the chair, the rope digging into his skin. Every breath sent a sharp pain through his chest. But he refused to let them hear him groan. Sullivan crouched in front of him, grinning like a man enjoying his work. You should have left well enough alone. Carter. He wiped his knuckles on a handkerchief, as if Jordan's blood was just another stain to clean up. I was hoping you were just another dumb soldier who didn't know when to quit. But you had to make this difficult, didn't you? Jordan forced himself to hold Sullivan's gaze, even as his vision blurred. You're scared. Sullivan chuckled. Scared? Of you? Jordan smiled through cracked lips. Of the truth. The amusement in Sullivan's eyes faded. He straightened and glanced at Roberts, who stood by the doorway with his gun resting casually against his shoulder. Where's the data? Sullivan asked. Jordan said nothing. Sullivan sighed. I don't have time for this. He reached for his belt, pulling out a switchblade. Let's see if a little motivation helps. Jordan braced himself. Then, something shifted. Carl. He was still tied to the chair across from Jordan. But something about the old man's posture had changed. His breathing was steady. His hands were twitching slightly behind his back. Jordan frowned. Carl wasn't scared. He was waiting. Sullivan turned his back to Jordan, stepping toward Carl. I'll start with the old man. Maybe that'll loosen your tongue. The moment Sullivan reached down, Carl moved. In one swift motion, he yanked his hands free, cutting through the ropes with a small, rusted blade he had hidden in his palm. Before Sullivan could react, Carl drove the knife into his thigh. Sullivan howled, stumbling backward. Chaos erupted. Jordan surged forward, snapping the weakened ropes against his wrists and lunging for Roberts. The cop raised his gun. But Jordan was faster, slamming his elbow into Roberts' wrist and sending the firearm skidding across the floor. Carl, moving with surprising speed, grabbed Sullivan by the collar and slammed his head against the wall. The man collapsed with a grunt. Jordan turned just in time to see Roberts scrambling for the gun. He lunged, kicking the weapon out of reach before slamming his fist into Roberts' jaw. The cop hit the floor hard, groaning. Jordan didn't waste a second. He grabbed the fallen gun, steadying his breathing as he turned toward Carl. The old man was already at the door, checking the hallway. We gotta move, Carl rasped. Jordan nodded, stepping over Sullivan's limp body. He looked down at the man, bloody and groaning on the floor. Looks like I just made your job a hell of a lot harder. Jordan murmured. Then he turned and ran. The night air hit them like a slap. The cold was bracing, but Jordan barely felt it. His mind was racing. They had seconds, maybe minutes, before more cops arrived. Carl kept pace beside him, limping slightly but moving with determination. Where the hell did you learn to do that? Jordan asked between breaths. Carl let out a grim chuckle. You spend enough time in a cage. You learn a few tricks. Jordan wanted to ask more, but then he saw them. Flashing lights. A convoy of police vehicles turning onto the street. Engines roaring. He skidded to a stop. Carl did the same. Both men stood there, panting, watching as the full force of the Briarwood Police Department came barreling toward them. This wasn't just Roberts and Sullivan anymore. This was the whole damn system. Jordan's grip tightened around the gun in his hand. One chance. That's all they had left. Jordan and Carl moved like shadows through the abandoned industrial district on the outskirts of Briarwood. The air was thick with the scent of rust and oil, the remnants of a factory that had shut down years ago. Concrete walls loomed around them, broken windows reflecting the glow of distant police lights. Carl clutched his side, breathing heavily. I ain't run this much since '82, he muttered. Jordan kept his focus ahead, scanning for a way out. You're doing fine. Just keep moving. They had barely escaped the ambush. The moment they had stepped onto the street, police vehicles had swarmed in from both ends, leaving them with seconds to react. Now, they were ghosts in a town that wanted them dead. Across Briarwood, the manhunt had begun. News anchors spoke in urgent tones, their voices steady but calculated. Breaking news. A former Navy SEAL and a known ex-convict are on the run after a violent altercation with law enforcement. Authorities warn that both suspects are armed and extremely dangerous. Jordan's face filled the screen, followed by Carl's. The words wanted flashed in red beneath their photos. The message was clear. The truth didn't matter, only the story they controlled. Maya stared at the television in horror. They're trying to bury them. Her hands trembled as she switched off the screen. If Jordan and Carl were captured, they wouldn't get a trial. They wouldn't make it to court. She had to move faster. Maya sat at her desk, typing furiously. Every file, every document, every piece of evidence Jordan had gathered, she was sending it all. She chose her contact carefully. Elliot James, senior investigative journalist, The New York Times. She attached the documents, wrote a brief message, and hit send. A red error message flashed across her screen. Email failed to send. Her heart pounded. She tried again. Different recipient, different method. Blocked. She grabbed her phone and dialed Elliot's number. It rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. Then her screen glitched. Just for a second, her emails started disappearing, one by one. Someone was inside her system. Maya's stomach twisted. They knew. She yanked the power cord from the wall, killing the connection, but it was too late. They were watching her. The night air was cool against her skin as Maya stepped out of her office. Her mind racing. She had to warn Jordan. She had to. A hand grabbed her wrist. She froze. Two men stood in the shadows near the parking lot. Suits, clean cut, not cops. The taller one smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're making this difficult, Ms. Carter. Maya pulled back, her pulse hammering. Who the hell are you? The shorter man spoke, his voice casual. Think of us as problem solvers. Her stomach clenched. The taller man leaned in slightly. You've done enough. Walk away now, and maybe you'll get to keep practicing law. Maya swallowed hard. And if I don't? The smile disappeared. Then you'll end up like your brother. The words sent ice through her veins. They weren't bluffing. Maya forced herself to stand her ground. If you're threatening me, that means you're scared. The shorter man exhaled, almost amused. Scared? No, Ms. Carter. We're just making sure you understand your options. Then he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Choose wisely. Maya didn't move until they walked away. Disappearing into the night, she clenched her fists, anger burning in her chest. They had just made their biggest mistake. They thought she was afraid. But she wasn't. She was ready to fight. The USB drive was scratched and battered, but it held the key to everything. Jordan sat in the shadows of the abandoned warehouse, the dim glow of his laptop screen casting sharp angles across his face. His fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, sifting through the files that Mitchell had risked his life for. Transaction logs, off-the-books payments, case files that had been buried deep. And then, a name. Richard Beckett. Jordan's breath stilled. The mayor of Briarwood. The man who stood in front of cameras, shaking hands, preaching reform. The same man who had given speeches about rebuilding trust between the community and law enforcement. A liar. A puppet master. Jordan clenched his jaw. Mitchell had found the smoking gun, the bribes, the protection money, the orders that had trickled down from Beckett to Sheriff Clark, from Clark to Roberts and Sullivan. Beckett wasn't just turning a blind eye. He was the architect. Jordan exhaled slowly, his mind clicking into place. This was bigger than he had thought. But if Beckett was the head of the snake, that meant there was only one way to end this. Cut it off. The warehouse smelled like dust and old metal. Jordan adjusted the earpiece Maya had given him. She was on the other end, stationed in a safe house across town. You sure about this? She asked. Jordan loaded the magazine into his pistol, checking the chamber. No. Maya exhaled. Good. That means you're still thinking straight. Jordan smirked despite himself. Just keep the line open. Maya hesitated. Be careful, Jordan. He ended the call before he could second-guess himself. Roberts and Sullivan arrived 10 minutes later. They stepped inside the warehouse cautiously. Their guns drawn. They thought they were hunting him. They were wrong. Jordan moved fast. He struck Sullivan first, slamming his forearm against the cop's wrist, forcing the gun loose. The weapon clattered to the floor as Jordan drove a knee into Sullivan's gut. Roberts spun toward the noise. But Jordan was faster. He leveled the pistol at Roberts' head. Don't move. Roberts froze, his lips curling into something between amusement and irritation. You know how many people have pointed guns at me, Carter? Jordan's voice was steady. Bet none of them pulled the trigger. Roberts' smirk widened. You won't either. Jordan ignored him, his focus shifting to Sullivan, who was groaning on the ground. Get up. Sullivan obeyed, his hands raised. Jordan's grip tightened around the gun. Tell me who you really work for. Roberts let out a dry chuckle. You still don't get it, do you? He took a slow step forward. There's no justice coming for you, Carter. No cavalry, no last-minute rescue. Jordan didn't move. Roberts tilted his head. You think exposing Beckett changes anything? The system isn't broken. It was built this way. Jordan felt his pulse slow. The words weren't surprising. They were just confirmation. You're stalling, Jordan said. Roberts shrugged. Maybe. Then, a gunshot. Jordan flinched. Roberts stumbled. Blood bloomed across his chest. He hit the ground, coughing, eyes wide in shock. Jordan's gaze snapped to Sullivan, who was lowering his own pistol. Sullivan exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. I never liked the guy. Jordan barely processed what had happened before Sullivan started backing away. You should be thanking me, Sullivan said. Jordan's gun was still trained on him. Why'd you do it? Sullivan smirked. I don't owe anyone anything. I do what it takes to survive. Then, before Jordan could react, Sullivan turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness of the warehouse. Jordan let out a slow breath. Robert's body lay still at his feet. The pieces were shifting, and the endgame was coming. The news broke at dawn. Maya had spent the entire night sending files, cross-checking sources, and making sure the story couldn't be buried. The moment the clock struck 6, the first wave of headlines hit. Corruption scandal in Briarwood. Mayor linked to police cover-ups. FBI opens investigation into Briarwood law enforcement. Leaked documents reveal network of bribery, murder, and abuse of power. Within hours, the town was in chaos. The New York Times, CNN, The Washington Post. Every major news outlet had the story. Reporters swarmed City Hall. FBI agents arrived in unmarked SUVs. By noon, Mayor Beckett had resigned. By sunset, Sheriff Clark had been taken into federal custody. And by the next morning, Patrick Sullivan, the last man standing, was finally arrested. The courtroom was packed. People from across Briarwood crammed into the wooden pews, waiting for the trial of the man who had betrayed them all. The air was thick with anticipation, tension coiling around the room like a live wire. Sullivan sat at the defendant's table, dressed in a dark suit that did nothing to hide the exhaustion on his face. His once confident smirk was gone. Now, he looked like a man drowning. Jordan sat in the back, arms crossed, watching. He hadn't spoken since the trial began. He had no desire to. The evidence spoke for itself. Transaction records, witness testimonies, the video of Roberts and Sullivan planting drugs on innocent people, the files detailing bribes and illegal arrests. And then, finally, came the verdict. The judge's voice rang out through the silent courtroom. Guilty. Murmurs spread across the room. Some gasped, others nodded, as if they had expected nothing less. The sentence followed. Patrick Sullivan, for your role in conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of aggravated assault, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck. It was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for interviews. People cheered. Some cried. Jordan and Maya stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Sullivan was led away in handcuffs. Maya exhaled. It's done. Jordan didn't answer. Because it wasn't. Not really. A town didn't heal overnight. A system didn't fix itself just because one man fell. There would always be another Beckett, another Clark, another Sullivan. Maya nudged him. We did the right thing. Jordan nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. They had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. As Jordan stepped away from the crowd, a man in a gray suit approached him. His presence was unremarkable. Average height, clean-shaven, with the kind of forgettable face that could blend into any room. But his eyes were sharp, calculated. He stopped a few feet away. You think you changed something, Carter? His voice was smooth, almost amused. This was just one battle. Jordan studied him, silent. The man smiled. We're still here, and we're just getting started. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Jordan stood there, his fists tightening. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cemetery was quiet. A light breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The sky was overcast, casting a gray shadow over the field of headstones. Jordan stood motionless, staring down at the simple stone marker before him. Bear, loyal to the end. His jaw tightened as he crouched, brushing away a few stray leaves from the grave. He had spent years watching his teammates fall in war zones across the world. But nothing had prepared him for this kind of loss. Bear had never questioned him, never doubted him, never betrayed him, and in the end, he had died because Jordan had refused to look the other way. Reaching into his pocket, Jordan pulled out a small object, his Navy SEAL trident, the pin he had earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Without hesitation, he placed it on the grave. A tribute, a promise, a silent vow that he would not let Bear's death be for nothing. Maya watched from a distance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had seen this side of her brother before, the quiet, unshakable resolve. It was the part of him that made him a warrior, the part of him that would never stop fighting, no matter how much it cost. When he finally rose to his feet, she spoke. You leaving town? Jordan nodded. Yeah, but I doubt it'll last. Maya smirked. You were never good at sitting still. He looked at her. What about you? She let out a slow breath. I'm staying. There's too much work left to do. Jordan studied her, searching her face. You sure? Maya met his gaze, unwavering. We stopped them here. But this was just one town. One fight. There are 1,000 more just like it. And if we don't keep pushing, nothing changes. Jordan didn't argue. He had always known his sister was stronger than people gave her credit for. She reached out, resting a hand on his arm. We can't save everyone, Jordan, but we can at least clear a path for the ones who come after us. He gave a small nod. Then make damn sure they follow it. Maya grinned. Oh, you know I will. The letter arrived that evening. Jordan had been preparing to leave, packing only what he needed. Cash, a burner phone, the essentials. But the envelope, plain and unmarked, had been slipped under his motel room door. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper. 6 words. You won this battle. The war continues. Jordan exhaled slowly, reading the message twice. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The system didn't crumble overnight. Corruption didn't vanish because a few men were put in prison. There would always be another Beckett, another Sullivan, another shadow lurking behind the scenes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jordan folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Then, without looking back, he walked out the door. Justice isn't just about winning one battle. It's about never stopping the fight. Jordan Carter exposed the truth. But did he really change the system? Or did he only scratch the surface of something far bigger? Corruption doesn't die in a courtroom. It adapts. It hides in the shadows, waiting for its next move. So we have to ask ourselves, how many more Jordans will it take before justice isn't something we have to chase, but something we can trust? What do you think? Does the system ever truly change? Or is it just a cycle repeating itself? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on power, deception, and the fight for justice, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths. The next story might be even closer to reality than you think.